Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Raul Carrillo, and I'm the Deputy Director of the LPE project. Thank you for joining us. As you know, we had hoped to gather in person last April for the Democracy Beyond Neoliberalism conference. However, thanks to the patience and resilience of the community, we are thrilled to be hosting this virtual conference series. Our entire lineup of events and registration links, as well as a sneak peek at the upcoming blog posts, are all available at our website, lpeproject.org, where you can also sign up for conference-specific updates and reminders. Our next event, Moral Economy After Consumer Sovereignty, with Lou Corrine, Kate Redburn, Sanjukta Paul, Marshall Steinbob, and Sandeep Vahisen, will take place next Friday, March 12th, from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The project is thankful to the Cuny LPE chapter for helping to organize this event. Gabo Gutierrez, class of 2021, will be live tweeting from the chapter account. It is now my exceptional pleasure to introduce today's student moderator, Alberto Aguirre, Cuny Law School class of 2021. Originally from El Paso, Texas, Alberto has a background in cross-border union organizing. He is the 2021-2022 AFL-CIO Law Fellow. Alberto, please take us away.
Hey everybody, welcome. I'm really excited to be able to co-moderate this panel with my colleague Gabriel Gutierrez. So yeah, we'll get right to it. Yeah, we'll get right to it. I'm gonna give a quick rundown. We're gonna do brief introductions, bios, then we're gonna allow the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes each. After they all speak, we're going to open up discussion for between the panelists themselves, do some crosstalk, they can be able to discuss it. That'll go on for a little while, about 10, 14 minutes. Then I'll open up the Q&A, I'll open up discussion for everybody, all the attendees. And so if you have questions, please post the questions on the Q&A, and then I'll ask them to the ones that people seem to really like. And then I'll ask them, and then we'll be done. So let's get started right away. We'll start with Professor Forbath. Go ahead. Willy.
Hi, I'm Willy Forbath, and it's a pleasure to virtually be with all of you, both my fellow panelists and those of you who've come to talk with us. I'm going to talk very briefly about one of the projects I've been working on lately. Some of the people on the panel and some of you out there know about it. I've been studying a handful of socialist lawyers on the Lower East Side of New York about a century ago, and their work in helping to build the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, when New York City was, as it still is to some extent, a hub of garment making. With roughly 200,000 new immigrant workers, thousands of rank and file leaders and activists, and an assortment of union chiefs, these lawyers helped to wage massive general strikes, forge industry-wide agreements, and also took sides in clashes over how democratic and how pluralist their socialist union would be. These struggles with employers, courts, and police, and with one another were sites of constant legal invention. The new immigrants and their union set about reconstructing labor-capital relations on the basis of group rights that had no footing in the official legal order. Rights to strike, organize, and bargain on an industry-wide basis and be dealt with not as individual workers nor as one firm's employees, but as one big corporate body. These strikes, right, since they were aimed at gaining a closed shop, were flatly illegal as far as both federal and almost every state court was concerned. That tilted the playing field sharply in employers' favor, but it didn't settle the outcome of these contests. They are much dependent on how far workers were willing to hold fast for that demand, how far employers could be made to see an advantage in collective bargaining and putting a floor on wages in a wildly competitive industry. And that's one of the reasons that the garment trades was one of the very few sites in which this kind of experiment succeeded to a great extent, because it was so wildly competitive. A handful of far-sighted big manufacturers and retail magnates like Filene's came to see that despite its revolutionary ideology, the ILG could be a stabilizing force in a chaotic industry. The outcome also depended on how far both working class and elite opinion in the city could be swayed to support the strikers against police violence and against what could seem like reactionary dogmatic courts. So, for example, early on in this 2-3 year long contest, a strike on the part of young women cloak makers gained a decided advantage when New York's mayor decided he wanted no more repeat performances of widely reported police brutality and judicial bias that dogged his administration during the first wave of strikes. There were to be no more criminal court magistrates meting out month-long sentences to 16, 17, 18-year-old loudmouth picketing girls. Tammany Hall could live with the Garment Workers Union. So early on in this first strike, the mayor did something unprecedented, and he publicly told the police department that workers had a right to picket. He demanded magistrates show patience and compassion. In all these spheres, these socialist lawyers I'm looking at played an important part. Some of them also unabashedly took sides in internal union battles. They crafted and championed new kinds of group rights inside the union for workers to constitute themselves as ethno-racial groups, Jews and Italians. Later in the union's life, also Blacks and Puerto Ricans. The idea was that there would be Yiddish speaking and Italian speaking and later Spanish speaking organizers and newspapers in those languages, and that the union would push back against the prevailing assimilationist melting pot ethos that characterized socialist politics as much as mainstream politics in the US, and instead would cultivate a multicultural, pluralist brand of socialism. They also took sides, these lawyers did, in power struggles between the national and local union authority about who called the shots in collective bargaining, who decided to call, and what strikes demands would be. Here, some of the lawyers lined up behind the union chiefs in favor of centralized top-down kinds of decision-making, and others fought for a more participatory, bottom-up kind of union. So let me put, how much time do I have left? Time.
Yeah, you have time. You have about 7 minutes. You're good.
All right. So let me, I may not take up all of it, which would be fine. So let me put 4 themes on the table that emerge out of this research I've been doing. And they're all about lawyering and the kinds of moral, ethical, political, existential choices these activist lawyers confronted. What did it mean to be both a lawyer and an educator and cultural translator in respect of a movement most of whose rank and file didn't speak English? It meant that in addition to being a translator, you were really also a kind of culture broker and culture maker. You weren't just translating between Yiddish and English or explaining US law and institutions, but also in doing so, exercising a kind of social authority, even in respect of new immigrants who had their own ideas about unions and labor relations. You were doing so at the union hall. You were doing so, as a few of them were, very prolific writers in the Yiddish press. What did it mean to say to these ILG new immigrant workers that they had a right to strike and picket, notwithstanding what the courts and the police said? What kind of higher law supported them, and what difference did that make? how do you toggle between the kinds of rights claims, you make as a lawyer in court and the kinds you make in the union halls and in the press, in the immigrant press. In court, you'd be teasing out strands of doctrine that could be stretched to defend, say, the legality of a closed shop strike. In the context of strikers on trial for defying an injunction or violating some municipal ordinance. And your audience was at once the judge and the courtroom, which was crowded with union members and the press. Second, lawyers as strategists and power brokers in relations with employers associations and, in the case of local lawyer leaders, with the national union chiefs. Taking sides in unions' own internal politics and advocating on behalf of rank and file who chose them as representatives and stood with them. Lawyers who took this path proclaimed an ethic of solidarity, but that didn't mean they weren't exerting a great deal of power and influence. Then there were the specific ethical dilemmas, and they haven't gone away, of lawyering for workers engaged in all kinds of law breaking, given the kinds of collective action and strikes and picketing afoot, right? You could explain, and these lawyers did in all kinds of arenas, the justness and indispensability of the closed shop, but how to counsel workers embarking on a course of action that landed them in jail and often beaten by police and private thugs. And finally, these lawyers were institutional architects, shaping and reshaping, explaining the new kinds of grievance processes and arbitral machinery that they were crafting in collaboration with the employers associations lawyers, how to channel what you took to be the workers' vision of what shape these institutions ought to have, and where and how to design machines that gave up workers, right, freedom to engage in collective action and made the union into police over workers' choices to walk out. Often the defense of the closed shop, right, turned on laying out for all kinds of different publics, both the union's own constituents and the city public and the broader working class public, why the closed shop, right, which had its tyrannical aspects, about which, right, many, right, potential sympathizers were sensitive, how to explain that the closed shop as a tyranny versus the closed shop as something else hinged on the internal politics of a union, just how democratic that union was, and how much it was open to all. So frequently they would explain this may be a closed shop, but it's not like the kind of closed shop that keeps out people of color. It's not like the kind of closed shop that just tries to staunch, right, the flow of people who want to become members of the craft. They would talk about it being a closed shop, but an open union. And finally, right, how to explain the success. It wasn't simply that important capitalists were simpatico with the idea of organizing the industry in order to put a floor under wages and control the sweatshops that were not only a threat to workers' well-being, but also a threat to manufacturers that were trying to rationalize and sort of upgrade production. Well, there had to be an enormous number of people in the rank and file to explain, right, just what it was to demand a closed shop and what the stakes were. And here, part of what happened was an enormous, right, emigration of Bundist activists from Russia and Eastern Europe, the Bund having been this pioneering union movement among Jewish workers in revolutionary Russia. I don't want to take up any more time now. We can pick up all these threads. I can see Alberto already giving me the signal. So thank you for coming and looking forward to talking more.
Thank you, Mr. Forbath. That was great. Willy Forbath is the Lloyd M. Benson Chair in Law and Associate Dean for Research at the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. Willy is a regular contributor to the LPE project. Most recently, he wrote an exciting post on socialist constitutionalism and how revolutionary spirits were able to enshrine social and economic rights with no small part being played by socialist lawyers, as we just heard today. I recommend people take a look. It's a fantastic read. Up next, we have Lucie E. White.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alberto, and to all of you in LP for putting this together. I'm just delighted to be here. All of us are doing our best at social justice work as lawyers, scholars, organizers. We're all students, and we always will be. We come together today to learn to do it better. My talk isn't a how-to, though. Rather, I want to step back to look at an earlier social movement sparked by past and ongoing injustice in the hope that it will help us here today to envision more just futures in some ways that really build on the envisioning that these folks in this past movement were engaged in. Specifically, I want to draw on the Black Panthers 10-point program to contemplate specifically two questions. The first is about the Panthers' vision of the post-liberation state. And the second is about their vision of post-liberation provisioning. That is how to get the food on the table and the shelter above people's heads in a strongly democratic way. Let me start with an obvious preface. In the 1960s, the Panthers were battling a very real state, an egregiously violent police state that was sited at one periphery of a global racial capitalist metropole. Black people were slaughtered by cops on an ongoing, hourly, daily basis, both in the streets and in their homes, as of course they continue to be today. The Panthers' response to this real-time state had three parts. The first was taking up arms for self-defense under the Second Amendment. The second was seeking to dismantle the white terror state's police and armed forces. And the first was to end mass incarceration. For this end, they constituted a liberation movement, a counter state that would use principled violence as needed, of the sort that was being deployed by other colonized peoples across the globe at the time. But what can be imagined to happen after the battle is won? The Panthers knew what they wanted to provision, but they didn't know exactly how. And they didn't know whether they needed a state at all to do it. And if so, what kind? Let's start with what they wanted. The 6 points of provision in their 10-point program are probably familiar to a lot of you. They're all points that relate to things that are generally commodified in both capitalist economic systems and conventional human rights discourse. But they were going to shake up that commodification in significant ways. The 6 are a high enough income stream through either full employment or a guaranteed basic income. The means, the land, having land and the means to work it, or cash reparation for the amount of the land, the 40 acres and 2 mules. The next was cooperative housing as shelter rather than for the profit of landlords. The fourth was education that would give Blacks a sense of themselves in the world, a knowledge of their history, and a sense of their collective power. The next one was bread, and that opens up visions of local and regional food production. The next was clothing, and that could open up visions of harnessing workers, informal and formal workers' know-how to produce clothing in cooperative ways. And all of this provisioning would be undertaken in a spirit of peace and justice. They talked all the time about peace and justice. This might sound like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, but it has to be understood, and it was set forth in a very different way. Now, keeping this in mind, I want to return to the question of the state. What imaginaries of the transitional or post-liberation state might be required to provide in these 6 ways? 3 of the 10-point program's 6 forms of provision would require a hard state with the power, if needed, to persuade or coerce this massive redistribution of property interests, the redrawing of property interests through taxation, through outright expropriation, to the rewriting of background rules of common law. And it would also require the legitimacy to accomplish those redistributions through violence. And the taxation would have to be accompanied by, of course, land re-expropriation in many circumstances. Note that to accomplish this, the Panthers would have to have their imagined hard state reach across the globe, because obviously Amazon doesn't keep its trillions in Alabama and New York. So one obvious question with respect to this state would be how it would exercise this power judiciously, and if called for, how it could be constrained. That's the state form that's called for if the principal task, here a massive redistribution, would require substantial power backed up by violence. But what about the state forms for provisioning when the redistributive task is less blunt? Here I'm talking about education, for instance. How might the provision of education in a post-liberation setting be envisioned? And how might the state be best shaped to pull this off? The Panthers' 10-point program about education speaks about the educating in history, in self, in place in the world, teaching about the decadence of American society. I want to suggest several sources of their vision of what this post-revolutionary educational practice might look like. The first, and I have a series of pictures, but I'm not going to take the time to pull them up. The first is a wonderful picture, if you haven't seen it, of the several Panthers serving meals to school kids. Every day at its height, the Panthers served breakfast to 20,000 kids all over this country. These breakfasts would be a place where education, where children could come together in a setting in which they would feel a moment of peace and justice and self in embattled places like Los Angeles. It wasn't just this one activity that I want to call attention to, though. They also would have known about Black education practices at a time when literacy was being fought for by Black people at the expense of their at the expense of their lives during Jim Crow and before. The freedom schools that combined education of adults and kids with the voting rights drives that were taking place at the grassroots in Mississippi and elsewhere. The traditions of emancipatory education that were shaped in colonial nations in the midst of freedom struggles, and the neighborhood preschool programs in the Mississippi Delta and Black housing projects in Central and South LA, for instance, that were sometimes sponsored by the federal government, but were basically subverted by Black women, often refugees from Jim Crow in the Deep South, and became places where adults and very young children could build their own and each other's powers. Thinking about how a post-liberation state that draws together from these different ideas and realities might actually emerge through state power really invites us to think about different state formations that would support these kinds of practices from the bottom up. Do you need a state at all? Or could you have dispersed local experiments taking place all over the place. I think a state of some kind, democratic, bottom-up, would be called for post-revolution for at least 4 reasons, 3 material and 1 normative. The first, to coordinate flows of humans and things. The second, to ensure that less endowed sites, because of climate distress, for instance, could get the benefit of some of the surplus generated in more endowed sites. The third is to ensure a cross-regional flow or flows of credit on even playing fields. And the fourth is right in the zone that Willy was talking about, that you would need some kind of normative power in order to ensure that community provisioning, democratic provisioning would be possible, that crosstalk could take place in the plural translational ways that would be required for, in the complexity of communities, for people to actually come together. And that's after the many status hierarchies that plague communities are held in check. Some would say these functions could be dispensed in an anarchic way, what do? Is that true? Would there need, or could this, the world that the Panthers
10 minutes, just letting you know.
Okay, I've got one more sentence. Literally, could that happen? I think the Panthers were actually ambiguous on that. But what I do know is that after the revolution, when peace and justice reigns, a problem for everyone who's in the world at that time will be the question of whether we want to strip the earth and exploit one another in order to get all that we continue to think we need. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Professor. That's fantastic. Imagine being able to be in a group where you guys can, radically imagine what that world looks like. That must have felt fantastic. Anyways, so that was Professor White. Lucie White is the Louis A. Horvitz Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and Executive Committee member of the Harvard Center for African Studies. Her research interests include civil rights and civil liberties, poverty and human rights, environmental rights and policy, and comparative and foreign law in South Africa. Lucie has written for the LPE project also about law, political economy in South African context. Take a look, it's really good stuff. So we have next, Professor Whitlow, great Cuny law professor. Go ahead, take it away, Professor.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. By here, I mean on the panel, not at my dining room table. So I want to thank the LPE folks, particularly Corinne and Raul, for putting together a really fantastic conference against incredibly steep odds. And I also want to recognize Cuny Law's LPE chapter and Gabo and Alberto in particular for helping with this panel. So my initial idea for this talk, which I submitted in the before COVID times, was to look at the political formation of Trumpism as an outgrowth of the rising power of financialized real estate in our political economy, and then to draw political lessons from tenant law and organizing efforts against financialized landlords. And I'm going to change that up a little bit. I'm actually dropping the Trumpism part of that idea and instead focusing on what tenant struggles for housing justice, particularly in New York, where I'm based, can offer us in terms of moving beyond neoliberalism and racial and hyper-financialized capitalism toward a radical, multiracial, democratic socialism based in an ethic of solidarity and care. And I'm going to lay out my remarks along 2 lines. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how our current political moment is characterized by crisis and what I mean by that. And then I'm going to look at a couple of examples of tenant organizing efforts, first against a private financialized landlord, and then for strengthened tenant legal protections. So recently, a friend and fellow traveler who I think may be in attendance commented to me that so many law review articles from across the liberal to left spectrum begin by noting that we find ourselves living amid multiple interlocking crises. And I've definitely done that in my own work, citing to the various catastrophes we face. Gilded Age inequality, racialized police violence, rising authoritarianism and white nationalism, environmental collapse, endless war. And I'm probably missing some. But here I want to talk a little bit about how we think about that term, crisis, since how we think about it directly informs the horizons of our political possibilities and invokes specific politics and publics. And I'm thinking of crisis in a particular way here, through the prism of a subset of social theory that looks at how contradictions in capitalist social formations, which are always there, deepen in certain moments to the point that they rupture and imperil the reproduction of the entire social order. There's a quote supposedly from Lenin, unclear if it's actually from Lenin, where he says, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. It's in moments of intense social upheaval and political uncertainty, which don't necessarily last weeks and could in fact go on for years, that competing social groups vie to dismantle the taken for granted ideas and policy prescriptions, and even sometimes the entire political economic paradigms of the day, and set out to resolve deep crises on terms and through ideas that are beneficial to them. The anthropologist David Scott talks about these moments as conjunctures in which new problem spaces are created. He defines problem spaces as sets of questions and answers around which a horizon of identifiable ideological and political stakes hang. So I want to argue here that we're currently in this type of crisis moment. After the financial collapse of 2008, after Trump's election, after a summer of uprisings for racial justice, in which there's a deep struggle underway over the problem space, how we think about the relation between the state, market, and society, about race and citizenship, about law and order. And following the Jamaican-born British cultural theorist Stuart Hall, I want to say that the end game of this moment is contingent, with no guarantee of a preordained outcome. Hall was famous, or fond, I should say, of saying that majorities are not given, but must be constructed. And I think that's a sobering thought. While the struggle to construct new majorities is playing out on a number of fronts and in many different important ways, the tenant struggle, the struggle for housing justice, particularly in New York City, is of major significance. And I want to just acknowledge my own unabashed New York City centrism here. But I'm not only pointing this out because of that. As a number of commentators have noted, New York was one of the early laboratories of the neoliberal project that I'm now contending is on somewhat shaky ground. And real estate has played a major role in the neoliberal transformation of the city. In New York in the 1970s, the city spiraled into a fiscal crisis, which was settled in ways that are now very familiar to us. Organized labor was pulverized. The municipal welfare state was slashed. Austerity and disinvestment were meted out in racialized terms, and capital, particularly finance capital, was given free rein. Property was increasingly placed by law beyond the reach of democracy. The problem space of neoliberalism has been one in which market-mediated inequalities are dealt with through market-oriented solutions. In political economic terms, real estate has been a prime mover, often the default prime mover of growth and urban economic development, particularly in post-industrial cities. The trajectory of neoliberalism has been on prominent display through New York's intensifying crisis of affordable housing. The city's once robust system of rent regulation, which continues to be our largest affordable housing program, was shredded in the post-crisis decades with legislative loopholes carved into the law to give landlords the ability to take greater and greater profits, and in many cases to remove units from regulation altogether, in the process altering the race and class composition of entire neighborhoods. Between 1993 and 2018, New York City lost over 150,000 units of affordable rent stabilized housing. The gutting of rent stabilization, or rent regulation, I should say, operated as a magnet for financialized capital investment. From 2005 to 2009, private equity firms purchased 100,000 residential housing units in the city. I'll briefly tell the story of one financialized landlord in particular, this landlord, Vantage, purchased approximately 125 buildings citywide, with 90 of those buildings in Queens, for a price of over $500 million. Nearly all of those units were rent regulated. And baked into Vantage's business plan was the notion that a quick profit would be generated by a combination of raising fees and rents on existing tenants and or forcing them out altogether and replacing them with newer, wealthier, usually whiter tenants. This process of organized displacement and value extraction, which we should note is nearly always racialized, both in terms of which tenants are most vulnerable and in terms of which neighborhoods are targeted as undervalued in the first place, this is on display through Vantage's business practices. Shortly after its purchase of this portfolio of buildings, over one-third of the tenants in the portfolio had their first rent check returned. Portfolio-wide, there's a portfolio-wide failure to maintain building services. There's a mountain of eviction cases filed against tenants. And it's worth noting that these kind of tactics are often met with resistance, probably because of the contradictoriness of housing as a commodity whose exchange value is real estate asset and whose use value is people's home. That was the case here, and tenants and organizers banded together to challenge the landlord's predatory tactics, engaging in a number of really creative efforts, which I'm going to kind of go around because I see that I'm running a little bit low on time. I'll just say that overall, the law and organizing campaigns against Vantage and other private equity landlords yielded mixed results. There were significant victories and many tenants were protected from eviction, but the power of financialized real estate was not significantly diminished, and rents around the city continued to skyrocket and neighborhoods continued to gentrify. If struggles against private landlords have proven to be both important and somewhat limited, recent tenant organizing efforts for legislative protections illustrate the capacity of the tenant movement to bend state power to meet the needs of people over profits. In 2017, New York City passed the right to counsel in eviction proceedings, a law that's being used by organizers to build the power of a burgeoning tenant movement. In 2019, a major organizing push led our state legislature to significantly strengthen rent regulation for the first time since the fiscal crisis of the 70s, closing many of the loopholes that attracted financialized landlords like Vantage in the first place, and diminishing the power of financialized real estate more generally. In conclusion, and I hope I haven't run over, I don't want to suggest that these recent victories or others mean that our current crisis moment necessarily will be resolved in a favorable way. As I mentioned earlier, I think the outcome is highly contingent, and if history is a guide, the road to radical multiracial democracy in this country is more often than not a tragic one. But I do think what's happening in the housing space right now in New York City and beyond is disrupting some of the core terms of the neoliberal problem space, terms that have held since the late 1970s. Growing calls to cancel rent and force social housing, and the notion that evictions are state violence are fundamentally also calls to place property within the reach of democracy where it belongs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Whitlow. Fantastic. I think that's a perfect bridge. How do you do effective resistance? Organizations being prepared for that. I think that bridges perfectly with the next people who are going to speak. So Professor John Whitlow. John is an associate professor at the Cuny School of Law, where I go. It's a fantastic school, where he teaches primarily in the Community and Economic Development Clinic. He supervises the clinic's anti-displacement practice area. John has also written for the LPE project about gentrification, slumlord capitalism, and poverty law. All good stuff. I really wish we could talk more about all these things. All right, great. So I'll just shoot right next. Brian Kettenring, take it away.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Alberto, and thanks to you, John, and Willy and Lucie. Great presentations. I'm really enjoying this and looking forward to digging in. And I'm gonna try to pick up on your point, John, about contingency. So I'm Brian Kettenring. I'm a community organizer for about 26 years now. I'm currently co-director of the Center for Popular Democracy, And also I edit a journal for organizers called The Forge, which I'll put in the chat, some information on that. So I'm going to actually start. We have an honored guest here. We have lots of honored organizers and lawyers on the line, but I'm going to start by quoting one of your own from the law and political economy movement, Amna Akbar from Ohio State. She had this great op-ed last July in the New York Times, and I'm just going to start with a quote here. Leftist movements today see our crisis as intersectional. Police violence, global warming, and unaffordable housing are not disconnected, discrete problems. Instead, they emerge from colonialism and capitalism. Organizers recall these histories and tell stories of freedom struggles. And whatever you think of their demands, you have to be in awe of how they inaugurate a new political moment, as the left offers not just a searing critique, but practical ladders to radical visions. These capacious demands create the grounds for multiracial mass movements, our only hope for a more just future. So I'm actually, thank you for that quote, Amna. It's really, I would really urge people to check out the op-ed from last July. You know, I'm stepping down at CPD after 7-8 years in leadership there, and so I'm reflecting a little bit on my 26 years as an organizer and thinking about what I want to do next. And so I'm so glad to be with you here to talk about it. I want to talk some about the practical ladders that Amna refers to. And I was asked to comment a little bit about what's it like to be an organizer and to sort of think about the nexus between organizing work and legal work. So a couple things I would say. The first thing I would say to, you know, there are many law students here watching and participating, and many of you are presumably thinking about your futures. There are many types of organizing. And so I come out of a particular tradition in community organizing, but first thing I would say is there's lots of types of organizing, labor organizing, movement organizing, issue organizing, you know, and so on. So I would say if you want to learn more, understand it better, check out The Forge. I'll put is a good place to learn about it. You can follow us on Twitter. And, you know, we try to be a place to sort of where organizers can learn and strategize and think about their practice. And I hope we'll do more work with the LPE blog and really build the dialogue between organizers and movement lawyers, because I think that's so important. Whatever type of organizer you are or want to be, though, I think there's a couple of things that are pretty consistent, at least in my experience throughout. And I find hopefully these will be useful ways to sort of think about it. I mean, the essence of it is building mass-based democratic organizations. Sort of Willy talked about this in his comments, that where there's democratic structures and a whole set of key elements. There's a membership base, or at least a base, leadership, a structure, you know, an organizational structure. There's organizers with defined roles and how they relate to the members and the leaders. Hopefully there's a strategy. Sometimes there's not, which is concerning. And there's an organizing model as well as an organizational model. You know, all of these elements come together, no matter what type of organizing you're engaging in. So I had, you know, I'll just run through a few top line thoughts for those of you that are trying to understand sort of how do I think about my role in the landscape. Number one is, I'd say, learn about organizing, even if you're going to stay in lawyering. I think, you know, the thing about being an organizer is it changes your DNA structure at a cellular level. As Maurice Mitchell from Working Families Party said that to me a couple of years ago, and it really stuck with me. Like, it changes how you think about solidarity. It changes how you think about power. So one of my best organizing efforts in the late 90s was a similar to John's story of financialized housing, was fighting predatory lending in California in the late 90s. And we had one track of work on tenants' rights, and we had a whole track of, we were fighting these big multinational corporations who were coming in and buying up loans. It was highly racialized, as John said, and overcharging in communities of color and ripping people off and basically stealing people's homes. This was the sort of first round of subprime lending. That the second round is what collapsed our economy 10 years ago. But my point here is, learn about organizing, whether it's by reading about it, building relationships with local community organizations, or even better, try your hand for a few years and see if it's for you. You know, secondly, though, is to value the import of lawyers and non-organizers in movement spaces. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but we need to be in partnership at all levels. From afar, it occurs to me there's like 3 tasks that are really urgent for those of you, particularly those in the legal academy. I mean, one is to win the war of ideas. The sort of negative blowback from the law and economics movement shows up in our work every day. And so your ideas are better, our ideas are better. We need you to win the pure war of ideas, number one. Secondly, to know that there are lots of ways that lawyers can engage, whether it's narrowly in the sector I work in the organizing sector, or whether it's in advocacy or more broadly, as some of the previous panelists talked about. Finally, I'm just going to name a couple of questions. Maybe we'll be able to pick up on some of these in the discussion. But I think there are big, weighty questions facing the movement today. John touched on some of them in his comments. But here are the ones that keep me up at night. And many of these, no matter where you work in the movement, whether it's in lawyering or organizing or somewhere else, these are all things we're going to need to answer together. So I'll leave you with the 3 or 4 that I'm wrestling with every day when I wake up. There's the question of vision, as Lucie talked about in her comments, and of ideology, which all of the panelists have touched on, so important. And lots more to say there. There's a question that Amna Akbar has wrote about in her op-ed around the relationship between short-term fights and longer-term transformation. She talks about non-reformist reforms. It's a really important conversation. There's also a concept called the 3 faces of power, which is, what's the policy fight today? What's even on the agenda versus not on the agenda, sort of the second face of power. And the third face of power being ideology. And I think as organizers, we're often not very good at fighting it on all 3 levels simultaneously. We often get trapped just on the first face of power. There's other big questions about our dual information ecosystem in the United States, about how we finance the movement, about how we structure and democratize the movement, as Willy's comments touched on. And then there's small questions like how do we defeat white supremacist fascism, political realignments, democratic breakdown, just little things that we'll work on in the remainder of the panel. So I'm really glad to be with you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Brian. Everything pure gold. Every student attorney should have been writing down all of that. Such great information. Great. Thank you, Brian. So Brian is the former co-director at the Center for Popular Democracy. He led CPD's economic justice campaigns, including Fair Work Week, Fed Up, minimum wage, paid sick days, childcare, and Wall Street accountability. Additionally, Brian oversaw CPD's voter engagement portfolio, as well as CPD's New States Initiative and the Federal Advocacy and Campaigns Operation. Clearly a veteran organizer. Great. So finally, moving on to Connie. Go ahead, Connie.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Connie Razza. I'm so honored to be on this panel. I've worked with Brian before, and Willy. One of my formative experiences in my career was working for Unite, which is the daughter of the ILG and the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. So I very much appreciated that. I also just appreciated the focus, it turns out, on how we reimagine what's possible, how we envision a just future, how the moments of crisis present opportunities for us to reshape the path we're on. SEJ, which is the Social and Economic Justice Leaders Project, is really a movement utility for progressive organizations to hold a longer time horizon than often organizations are able to do on their own, to create the condition for proactive leadership and agenda setting and prepare for conditions that are outside of our control, and then to create space for movement organizations to practice responding to crisis and opportunity together, and to respond to the actual crisis and opportunity in front of us, rather than to the possibility that the thing that we've always worked on could be a thing that we could push forward in this moment. And so I am here basically to say holding the long view is critical, that too often, the structure of financing for movement organizations, the urgency of the crises in our communities militate toward short-termism ourselves, towards looking at what are the solutions to the symptoms that we're facing, and actually push out the possibility for us to look longer term. But the forces that we're combating, those symptoms, are symptoms of structures that have been in motion and under development for decades and centuries. So neoliberalism for more than 40 years, racial capitalism for more than 400 years. Like what we're facing today in the moment is actually from all of that. And so we actually need the space to be able to plan, to strategize, and to form the kind of relationships that allow us to respond to those crises with our long view in mind. The problem, though, is that holding that long view is really hard, because those symptoms that we face are urgent. They are life-changing and life-threatening, and sometimes life-taking, right? If you just look at what we've gone through this past year, the ways that people's lives have fundamentally shifted because of a commitment, deep, deep commitment to free enterprise and to a kind of liberty that means that we're not going to keep communities and individuals safe and sound in the face of a pandemic. Like that is because of the ideologies that have been really promoted and systematized over time. And so being able to meet those urgent needs is absolutely critical. And meeting those actually pushes out to some degree the space for us to be able to make those longer term strategies and plans and moves. But we need that long term in order to structure what we're doing in the short term to ladder up to actually dismantling the neoliberal and racial capitalist structures that we have. And then I'll just name that often we're funded for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and we have to show benchmarks. Actually, neoliberalism at work in the sort of philanthropy that that we are counting on in order to structure. And so I just point back to what Brian was saying about like needing to really think about how the movement is financed. And then the last piece that I really want to hone in on is this importance of bridging with lawyers, with the academy. That one of the things that I think the academy offers is really a stewarded space for this longer arc thinking. And so really being mindful about how we are partnering together so that the inquiries, the explorations, and the products are reflective of and available to our movements is critical. The papers that we heard earlier are actually so informative right now for the kinds of questions that we are facing in this moment. And so how do we make sure that we're building those bridges together? I think too that the papers that we heard and the work that academics do reminds us that we need to reset our analysis, our tools and tactics, and our strategies in order to meet the moments that we're facing. And I think right now that we are all, this is the part that I always struggle with actually articulating in a sort of like, you know, academic way or something. We're in the middle of trauma. And part of that trauma is gunning the engine on the strategies, the tactics that we have been using, even though we know they haven't worked, right? And so we're digging ourselves into a rut, and we don't have the space as a movement to actually process what we've gone through over the last 4 years in order to be able to reimagine what we need to be doing to meet this moment in order to be able to access, to envision a different future for ourselves. And so really figuring out how we can bridge between sort of academic spaces, lawyerly spaces, organizing spaces, community spaces, and hold the space for us all to process that trauma, to be able to learn from the lessons of the past, vision where we're heading and strategize toward that, not just the sort of unicorns and puppies version of that, but like, how do we get there? And then actually change our tactics and strategies in order to meet this moment, in order to get us there. I will stop there.
I mean, fantastic, perfect, like bow around to like tie everything all together. I mean, it's good to see that lawyers can be good and can help people, and at least that organizers feel that we can provide something valuable, which I appreciate. Great, so that was fantastic. So now what we got about 10 minutes, 10-ish minutes, a little bit less. So I'm just opening up the discussion to all the panelists, crosstalk. If I cut anyone off, if I yelled at them, just go ahead and like, this is your opportunity to talk to each other. So, and if not, I have some questions to stir the pot.
Let's see. Do we just raise our hands or what do we do?
Go ahead. Well, go ahead,
Yeah.
Professor.
Yeah. I just want to do a shout out to everybody that spoke. But I want to I circled a couple of things in red that Connie said that I just want to emphasize, where she talked about laddering up between responding in I don't remember the word you used, but responding to trauma and kind of moving in a realistic way toward vision. I think that you just spoke beautifully, and that's so important to figure out ways you can move from one to the other and focus on that as a major area of strategy. And the other thing I wanted to raise in Brian's comments, I spent a lot of time in Head Start 20 years ago in Los Angeles, Central LA, and spent a lot of time talking to women in the Head Start programs who had been involved in the welfare rights movement from that perspective. And they hated mass-based organizations. They couldn't stand them. They couldn't stand George Wiley. They couldn't stand bureaucracy. And their vision of organizing was very different. It was people getting together in Head Start programs and serving breakfast to the kids and finding their way as they did that. And so I just wonder if they're not theories of organizing that don't always, talk about mass movements. That's what I would just ask there.
Yeah, it's part of, just to pick up that thread, I think part of why I made the comment I did, there's so many types of organizing, and some of the most interesting community organizing that I've seen lately, and I've learned about in the last 10 years, is actually focuses on building community first as a predicate for action. And so, I think, John, you worked at Make the Road New York, and I was going to name Make the Road New York as a good example of that, where it's actually founded by two lawyers. Yeah, and so they built a really interesting model. I come out of a tradition of organizing that sort of descends from the national welfare rights movement in sort of circuitously. The immigrants' rights movement has really innovated, as have others in lots of other spaces. It's just I'll use it as an example, but really focusing on building community and from there taking action. But there's also questions of taking action at what level. Like, I don't think that's part of why I made the point that I did, is there are many ways to connect to movement. Not everyone wants to do mass action. We actually, I think the research shows we don't need 100%. In union organizing, you have to get 10% of your community organized to win. The research, if you want to take down undemocratic dictators in semi-democratic societies, you need 3.5% of the community organized. So we don't. My point is, we don't need everybody to do the same thing. There's a lot of diversity of ways to get organized.
Right. Great, thank you.
Anyone
And I'm
else?
really, yeah, just a quick response. I'm really glad you mentioned Make the Road and the work that Jennifer Gordon did earlier, because that first effort was very much based on Paulo Freire's approach to organizing, which does start from community and empowers people through their activities in community, and then does the legislative organizing on that basis. So,
Great, fantastic. Also Make the Road also just unionized, so that's always good too.
right.
If no one has, I have a question. I'll shoot it. This is a question that I've developed with my co-moderator Gabriel Gutierrez. You know, attorneys have had a useful role in these social movements, and something that I'm always worried about is and you know, I don't even know if this is even true, but I feel like lawyers may, you know, tend, because they're like, you know, bought into the status quo, they've learned about it, they're, you know, they're kind of technocrats. Like, I feel like maybe they can often be like a tempering force on like the radical like spirits, the radical demands of social movements that they're helping. I'm curious if that's even true. And assuming that that is true, let's say and if it was true, how have organizations in the past or in the present been able to, you know, keep it to the demands of the people that the lawyers are supposed to be helping. Basically, the lawyers don't take charge and they don't take center stage, and you know make more moderate demands and stuff like that. Opening it up.
So
I think you know, based on mainly on my experience working at Make the Road, which has now come up 3 or 4 times already, I think that you have to have structures in place that, you know, hold attorneys, I guess hold attorneys accountable to, in Make the Road's case, a membership, but also intentionally flatten hierarchies to the extent that that's possible. I mean, I think that maybe it's always a bit aspirational, but I think certainly when I worked at Make the Road, and you know, Make the Road is, along with Cuny and a couple of other institutions that I've been affiliated with, it's a place that I'm incredibly proud to have been connected to. And one of the reasons was that, you know, as attorneys working there, we constantly felt sort of, I think, I don't want to say beleaguered, but we, you know, I think that the idea that, you know, you're an attorney and you're sort of coming in from on high, which is a hard, that's inculcated in all of us to some degree or another, whether we like it or not. You know, being at Make the Road really chips away at that. You know, like I remember very, very vividly, I had delayed on responding to a member's problem. And I remember, because the members of Make the Road were frequently present at Make the Road, we all were in the same space together. And I remember her pulling me up in the courtyard and saying to me, "You deal with this in the next few hours, or I'm going to go talk to Andrew and Una." And I did. You know, she was right. So yeah, just, you know, that's not necessarily representative of a structure or an example of one, but I think it does go to the point of accountability.
I think that proximity to members is so important. I also, though, think that there are times where the opposite is true, and the lawyers want to go further out on the limb because they don't have very much at stake, actually, right? And so I think that the accountability needs to go in both directions, and that it is like respectful of the expertise that each party brings. So when I was at Unite, we were involved in comprehensive campaigning, and I think that there's a degree of comfort that a certain both kinds of organizers and kinds of lawyers have with a different levels of risk. And that part of what lawyers bring is an expertise at how to take those risks, but also hedge them appropriately, and to really inform what are the decisions that you're making based on the degree of risk, and then enable people to make informed decisions about what they're going to do. And I think, the two things that I see happen most, and this is both sort of lawyers, but also I led the research and policy work at CPD and also at Demos, and in that realm as well, that happen is that there's a kind of expertise that gets valued in the world. You all will end up with degrees and letters behind your names, and that is one of them. And so there's either like really lording it over other folks, and like that is the way to be. There's another one though that I would caution against, which is really underplaying the expertise. And the goal, hopefully, is to have access and knowledge that you're able to leverage in the service of these movements. And in order to do that, you actually have to own it. You actually have to acknowledge what you know and bring that to bear in the conversations with humility. But it does nobody any good to sort of like hide the ball a bit on it. That those strategies are also strategies that are valuable.
Thank you. Yeah, and that reminds me, my apologies, Connie. I wanted to get to the questions right away. I did not do your bio. Connie's executive director at the executive director of the Social and Economic Justice Leaders Project. Connie has written for the LPE project about creating policy that creates positive feedback loops that in turn builds community organizations' power. Connie was previously the chief of campaigns and built the strategy research department at the Center for Popular Democracy and was vice president of policy and research at Demos. My apologies. That I wanted to get to the questions. Anyways, we have time for like one little quick, discussion. One last thing that the panelists want to say, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A. We have a couple questions lined up. Some of them are pretty good, and one's from a Cuny lawsuit, and so that will take precedent.
I don't know who's. Oh, okay. Yeah, I have a question that in some way builds on the last comment that Connie made about owning your power, but being with humility, but goes back to an ethical dilemma that Willy flagged, and that is the issue of illegality and how you handle as a lawyer working with a movement. Issues where illegality seems to be called for. And, civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience is kind of the easiest case in some ways. But I just want to raise that because certainly in the liberation movements of Africa, it wasn't necessarily just civil disobedience.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, great. That was fantastic. I think I learned a lot. I hope everyone did. That was really fun. So we're going to open up the discussion to everybody, to all the attendees, panelists, everything. So I'm going to go look through the Q&A. We have a couple questions people want to ask. I'll go ahead and read the first one that came in. This is from an anonymous attendee, very mysterious. Willy, do you think an alliance between socialist lawyers and unions could happen again in the 21st century, perhaps for tech industry workers or gig workers like rideshare drivers? What socio-political environment might need to occur in order for that to happen?
Great.
Yeah, of course, I think it's possible. And indeed, what little I know about what's afoot in the tech industries, it's already happening. But so I'm not sure I have much to add about the socio-political environment, other than, you know, there isn't much point in trying to read the environment so much as to see what you can stir up, for the reasons that John nicely sketched. This is about as good an environment as I've seen in at least since the 60s. I'm enough of a graybeard to have been at least a very young leftist in the 60s. But since then, or the early 70s, since then, nothing like this has been afoot. And specifically in respect of what I was talking about today, labor organizing, it's not the case that the worst kind of oppression from above is what necessarily breeds the greatest possibilities for left movements and socialist policy. Certainly not in US history, right? So it's better to have, given a choice or given a, you know, if it's reading environments, a liberal regime that's more or less pro-labor, like the Biden one, is a more hospitable environment, all things considered, in which to push for left reforms and more radical action. And that's what we have it's been ages since we've had a president speaking out in favor of unions and workers' rights.
Thank you. I mean, that's fantastic. There's also like a follow-up question from a Cuny law student, actually. So Sulafa, asking about the specific role of transactional socialist lawyers and how they could support the formation of workers. So we're talking about, you know, that it's a good, you know, fertile soil to do this kind of work. But what exactly could someone like this, like a transactional attorney, do? How could they help, right?
I feel like that's maybe in my wheelhouse.
Go for it, John.
Okay. Yeah. So the clinic that I teach in, we does a lot of work supporting worker-owned cooperatives. So we work in the it's the Community and Economic Development Clinic. So we work in the sort of workers' rights space, but in a way that I think is sort of atypical, because our work is transactional, which essentially means that we're helping worker-led organizations, worker-owned organizations, form, get themselves organized, including helping with their governance, providing them kind of an array of different kinds of legal assistance. So I think that's a really obvious answer. I mean, I think you could come up with different types of similar sort of transactional work in support of people who are trying to decommodify different kinds of spaces, whether it's housing or in terms of the work we do, worker-owned cooperatives. So that's an example. And since the questioner is a CUNY student, I urge you to look into our clinic, and it's shameless self-promotion, but look into our clinic, and hopefully we'll see you there in the next couple of years.
Another endorsement, I took Professor Whitlow's CED seminar. It was fantastic. So that's another plug. Any other panelists' responses to what Professor Whitlow has said?
There's much written, and I'm not going to go deep in the weeds, but the more creative uses of capital out of union pension funds is famously a large, often untapped source of capital for cooperatively owned enterprises. And now is a good moment to push various unions to use the law creatively, and there's law to be used to make certain streams of capital available for worker-owned enterprises. So That's just another angle from John's. Yeah.
Mhm.
And by now, some states are even experimenting with public banks, which will become yet another
Mhm.
source of capital.
Mhm.
I think that question just ties in perfectly with what another person has asked in the Q&A, talking about, and what Connie mentioned earlier about, neoliberal funding structure and all that, and like how it kind of, how it's intentional, how it can be intentional, right? So I'll just read it from here, also from an anonymous attendee. This person just keeps asking questions. Also, with regards to the financial structures of social movement orgs replicating neoliberalism, is there a meaningful action that organizers could take to mitigate that? What might alternative financial structure look like?
I wonder, Brian, if you want to take a stab at that from the work that CPD has been doing with its affiliates.
Yeah, and I thank you. I mean, the first thing I would point to is the labor movement, right? Part of the significance of the labor movement is that it's democratically financed and it's financed from its members up. And I think the precipitous decline in union membership is probably if not one of the 2 or 3 greatest sort of strategic dilemmas for the progressive movement in the United States and the left. And it's so important because it's self-financed. I think we have struggled in the community organizing sector. My organization, many of the actors in our sector are pretty much dependent on large individual donors or private foundations. Those investments can play a really important and helpful role. But I think that I think the pathway out and the answer to the question is we have to innovate new ways of organizing that. And we've been experimenting with this at CPD, and a lot in our field are of trying to basically build new forms of grassroots revenue from the membership on up. And it's actually, it's hard to do. And, there are other models. Move On does it pretty well. Like they're in different types of models of organizations. There are a lot of ways to do that, but I think it's essential for those of us to basically, we have to invest in new models, and we need more brain power and more smart organizers and smart lawyers and others really trying to solve this problem, because I think it's a fundamental structural constraint, and it inhibits, but it's like an ideological constraint and a growth constraint at the same time. And until we break it, that sort of logjam, it's going to be a serious barrier.
I will add to that, though, that there are a range of capacities that I think fall outside of what would be able to be supported by members. And that one of the, I hate to be the one to do this first, but like one of the lessons of the right is that organized patient money invested in ideologically aligned, but pretty free, pretty liberated projects actually is also pretty important. And so the role of philanthropy, I don't think that the argument is that philanthropy should be like, we should not rely on philanthropy at all, but that the bets need to be longer bets in an approach and a set of projects that aren't supposed to produce the win in a year or 2 years, but have something more like 10 years or 20 years of investment to build a thing and really experiment and fail and be able to learn from that failure with a community of other organizations. And so I think that pairing up a different structure of the philanthropic major donations and the member-based finance streams feels to me like an important portfolio.
Is it a concern that is blown out of proportion that these large donors do they have some type of effect on terms of this? I actually agree that free ranging the concepts and allows you to succeed or fail. I'm curious, is that blown out of proportion that they have a lot of say and a lot of control over their funding and things like that? I'm just curious.
I don't understand.
Yeah, so I'm just asking, like, so like, you're saying that it's not entirely wrong to allow like funding from donors. Is that's like correct? So like, I'm curious, like, is there like a possible negative result from that? And I'm thinking explicitly, like, where they may have too much control over where that money goes, or because I'm thinking like,
Sure.
when it's union dues, it's democratic. And I'm curious, is that a real issue, or is it kind of blown out of proportion, the concern?
I mean, I think it's a real issue, and I think that's why my suggestion is sort of a less granular set of benchmarks or something that organizations need to show, and more relational, like longer term investments in the experimentation and in sort of the sets of sort of an ecosystem of organizations that are working together. I also think, just to name, like, and to, I think, Lucie's question early on, that it's to an ecosystem with a diversity of kinds of formations. So some of those will be more institutional players. Some of those will be like more like organizations, less institutional maybe, and some will be emergent formations that are coming up. I think one of the things that we've seen recently, I'm going to say since Occupy, but I'm sure that historians would be able to point to something before that, but is like this flipping of the spark for movement moments comes less from pre-existing sites of organization, whether those are community-based organizations or churches, and more from sort of the kind of the fast communication of social media and that kind of thing, and then channeled maybe into organization or not, right? And so how are we thinking about the relationships across the ecosystem in that way?
Yeah.
And then how do we fund in a way that allows those relationships to develop and to ground, but also for us to actually experiment with each other and not have to put a 2-year timeline on like what we're going to show as product on the other side. And I think that that's the difference. So absolutely, there's a threat that it could be overly controlled, but I think that the fact is that there's a resource issue, and there are a lot of resources in philanthropy, and figuring out how to be able to use them. And a ton of like philanthropy is doing good. How can we do better,
Yeah. I don't want to jump in, but I think just getting a better handle on what the kind of coordination of that ecosystem would look like is relevant, not just for funding, but for much more. So I just really appreciated how you spun out your thinking on that, actually. I was drawing pictures.
Yeah, we're nearing the finish line. This is last call for the panelists to give their one last remark if they want to, or if they want to hit a point that maybe they weren't able to. So go ahead, free for all.
Well, I just really want to appreciate the work that y'all are doing. I feel like I'm very sincere that the study that you are engaged in is actually so relevant to the conversations that we're having also. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation and thinking about other venues to pull you into discussion with the movement organizations that we're working with.
No. And I want to just say what a teaser it was to listen to those who've had years and years and years of organizing and just wanting to hear more. And I want to really just thank everybody for including me in this so I could, hear Brian and hear John and hear Connie and just kind of take it in and think about it.
Same here. It's an honor to be with Connie and John and Brian.
I'll just also appreciate my panelists. The LPE project, you're doing really important work, creating some new and countervailing energy within the legal academy. And those of you watching and listening, it's been a great conversation. I'm sure we're all happy to help you navigate your ways into the movement as you proceed. So consider that an open invitation, at least on my part. I won't volunteer others' email inboxes. And as John said, this is a contingent moment in our society. So I sort of feel like the next few years are really going to decide which way we go. So really look forward to working with all of you to turn it in the right direction.
And I'll just chime in and say, same. And thanks everyone. It was a fantastic panel. And thanks again to the folks at LPE.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Whitlow. Yeah, I think that's it. Remember, people, they could check out the live tweeting from the Cuny's Twitter account. That's Cuny_LPE, and that live tweeting was done by our co-moderator Gabriel Gutierrez. Yeah. So I guess that's it. If the host LPE would like to say any last words, I think we can conclude our discussion, if I'm not missing anything.
You are not missing anything, Alberto. I hope that everybody will join us next Friday for Moral Economy After Consumer Sovereignty. Have a great Thursday, rest of the weekend, and we'll see you back here soon. Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, Willie. Bye, everybody.